In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's talk about missing data and what to do when you're asked to use data to help build conclusions, find insights, etc., but you don't have the data. Either it's not available to you because maybe it's a competitor that you're working against, or it's a potential merger and acquisition. You're being asked to guess at something. We had that happen relatively recently in the hospitality field. We had one client saying, "Hey, can you help us try to estimate whether this is a good purchase or not?" Or you're dealing with a situation where it might be adversarial. So, for example, in the whole Warrior Nun thing, people saying, "Well, how do we substitute the data that Netflix has? Because Netflix clearly isn't just going to hand that over to anybody." So, Katie, no matter what the situation is, maybe it's a dashboard that you've inherited that you don't know the underlying data sources. What do you think about when you're being asked, "Hey, we need to use data to make decisions, but we don't have any data for you"?
Well, I think about a lot of things when that comes up, but it's really, it's interesting. I think that there's this assumption, Chris, that you can magically reproduce any kind of data because you've spent a lot of time researching and figuring out where to supplement data and what data sources are close enough, but also how to use machine learning to infer data. Not every marketer has that skill set or that understanding of what that looks like. And so, when we are handed a report with no methodology statement, not even timeframes, things that just say last month, but we don't know what month that was, my first thought is there is no possible way you can expect us to replicate this exactly as it is using a different data source. There's way too many variables. And I think that's the first thing I think about when I hear about these situations or when they're presented to us is you don't know how data works, do you? And, and I don't mean that in a, offensive sort of like put down, but like you have to understand that there's a lot of variables that go into data in order to make it a one-to-one or close to a one-to-one comparison. It's one of the reasons, Chris, why when we're doing reporting, I get so finicky about the date ranges. And, if we have to, do it at like 12 o'clock in the afternoon versus, 1 p.m. the day before, my internal like data integrity alarms start going off. It's like, then it's not a one-to-one because you have an additional 12 hours that is not, being accounted for. And this goes back to my clinical trial academic roots of it has to be an exact, the 12 a.m. cutoff, the 12 a.m. cutoff here. Otherwise, you can't call it a one-to-one comparison. And so that's sort of the first piece that I think about is what are all the variables that go into the data analysis, that not even the analysis piece, the methodologies, the techniques, but even just the data to say, this is what we use. This is what this data represents. It's this date range, these cutoffs, these metrics, these whatever they are. Like those are the pieces that I 100% need to understand first. And 10 times out of 10, that information is not noted anywhere.
Exactly. I tend to think of this like you're handed a dish and you taste it, and then someone says, "Hey, can you recreate this?" And like, well, there's no recipe. I mean, you know what it looks like because it's in front of you, but there's no recipe, there's no instructions. You're not sure what the ingredients are, and I think that's where a lot of experience comes into play. If you're an amateur cook who's maybe only been cooking for a year or two, you may not have done, herb tasting experiments to see like what different herbs taste like in different settings. You may not have tried, bulgur wheat versus regular wheat versus, sprouted wheat. So you won't know those differences. But the more experienced you are, the more experiences you have, you're like, oh, that's white truffle oil. I know what that flavor is. Oh, that's a combination of celery powder and onion to get that kind of ranch dressing like flavor. And so the more experience you have, the more domain expertise you have, the easier it is for you to reverse engineer a dish that you're tasting at a restaurant. Perhaps you're like, okay, this is a really expensive meal. I kind of want to know how it works. And I think the same thing is true with data. When you're handed a dashboard, for example, just by looking at it and looking at the names of the metrics, or maybe even the font that it's in. You're like, okay, that's a data studio dashboard from Google, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the naming of that. That's almost certainly Universal Analytics versus GA4, because they reported, they report differently. And the more experience you have, you look at something like, okay, that's a Google business listing, or that's Search Console, that's not Google Analytics data. The easier it is for you to reverse engineer it, but it requires that level of domain expertise to go,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm pretty sure I know what this is. And even if I don't know exactly what it is, it's like that chef. Even if the chef doesn't know exactly that, if it's white truffle oil or black truffle oil, they're like, you know what, I can make something that's really close.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, it's interesting because we went through an exercise like that recently. And I'm certainly not the more experienced analyst on the team, but I was able to go through some materials that we were given and do just that. There were um, fields such as branded search and unbranded search, and I had enough expertise to know, okay, that's likely Search Console data. Where we didn't know enough information was the characteristics. I can't think of the word. The requirements, the qualifiers, basically the way in which the data was being filtered, um, to say I want it just for this kind of product, or I want it just for this kind of time frame, or this is what I consider branded and unbranded. And I feel like those markers, without having that, that's where we just start to guess at things. We make assumptions based on our expertise and our experience. But unless someone hands us a set of requirements, we don't actually know.
Exactly. And that's exactly like, here's the outcome, but we're not telling you what has to be in the recipe. Like, okay, I'm going to do my best guess. Yeah, the challenge you run into, obviously, is if somebody then says, "Oh, we forgot to tell you it has to be gluten free." Like, well, you should have told me that before I used this, 2 pounds of wheat to make this thing. Um, and the same thing is true with that. In that particular instance, we ended up re-engineering the Search Console data in R, in taking programming languages and recoding it
Mhm.
in order to make it look like and work like the original. I doubt that's how the original was made, but that was the most efficient and effective way that we could do it.
Mhm.
And so that then comes back to, well, how does somebody who is not an expert at digging data out of an API and then put it into a SQL database and then doing the engineering on it, how does a marketer like who is not me do that?
Well, they hire you. They pick up the bat phone and say, "Chris," I was total tangent. If you're watching this podcast, I was watching a video yesterday and someone was asking their kid, like, how do you answer the phone? And those of us who are older answer it like this. Those of us who are younger answer it like this, like they're holding a cell phone. So anyway, I was mimicking picking up the bat phone, calling Chris. And so if you are someone like me who doesn't have the skill set of a Chris Penn, then you really have to start to pick apart and just start asking a lot of questions. Now, the source that we got this from didn't know the answers to the questions we would have in terms of how this was put together. And so, without having a software development skill set, without having the ability to code something, then we're going to have someone like me would just have to go through and note all of the constraints, all of the different places where I could not replicate something because I did not have enough information. And, that's typical in terms of, standard data analysis of just noting I didn't have enough information to draw a conclusion. That's a perfectly acceptable response as long as you explain why that is. So, what you would need to do. So, let's say, Chris, you're handed a report and you don't have access to Search Console data, but they want you to list branded and unbranded search. That's going to be a nearly impossible feat if all you have is just straight Google Analytics. Like there's probably ways that you could, you know, use the query data, those kinds of things. but it's not going to be an exact 120. And so, what you would need to do in that situation is start to document. Here is what I assume this data is. I assume that it is Search Console data. I assume that there are filters to include the name brand and to not include the name brand, and that's going to be the branded and unbranded search. I don't have access to that data, so here's what I've put to stand in instead. And so what's often missing is just that simple documentation so that people explain, here's what I understand, here's what I don't have, and here's what I'm able to do. Because we tend to get it's either an insecurity or an overconfidence or both that we can just replicate it and put it out there and hopefully nobody notices.
And you hit on a really important point there, that there's the data, the technical capabilities, right? Can you replicate this report? But the other challenge you run into is if you don't have the data itself. I mean, that in itself presents a really interesting challenge, and again requires that level of subject matter expertise within your industry, but also within the data ecosystem that exists online, to say, okay, well, we don't have that information. What can we get instead? So to your point about branded, unbranded search, if you don't have that data from someone's search console, where else could you get that information? Well, you can get it from a couple of places. You can get it, for example, from Google Trends. You can get a relativistic measure of one brand search versus another. You can get it from SEO tools like Ahrefs and SEMrush and SpyFu and stuff. And then you have to engineer it together to say, okay, here's the reverse engineered version of this data set based on these two sources. So you can calibrate it. Another example that is one that we can share. We were asked, I was asked as part of the whole Save Warrior Nun campaign, hey, how do we show interest or relevance, knowing that we can't get Netflix to give us the watch data, right? So where else could we go? And this is one of those things I think is incumbent upon everyone, regardless of what you're working on, to know what data sources are available in your industry that you could use as proxies. So one of the ones that we use as a proxy is IMDb ratings, the Internet Movie Database. Users of that system, of that software, can go in and leave ratings and reviews. And the number of votes that a show gets tends to be proportional to the viewership, right? For example, in a recent look at the data, Stranger Things got like 10 times the number of votes of any other show. Makes logical sense. Netflix pays $1 gazillion to promote that show. Of course, it should have higher numbers of votes. And so in those cases, we can say, okay, well, we're going to use this as a proxy for viewership because we don't have the viewership data. But it passes the sniff test in terms of investment, in terms of what we see online with social media data, with search data. The IMDb data triangulates pretty well on. So we can say, okay, we're going to use this as our proxy measure to then be able to compare one show versus another. And because it's industry-wide, you can now go outside of that one ecosystem and say, okay, how does Stranger Things or Warrior Nun compare to The Mandalorian, which is on Disney Plus, a totally different network? And so by knowing the data sources within an industries and what's available online, you can start to build directionally correct models. Is it going to be exactly those numbers? No, it won't be exactly the proprietary numbers, but is it good enough to make valid comparisons? I would argue yes, it is. It's you can look at that data and go, okay, Stranger Things has 10x the traffic of any other Netflix show.
And it's interesting because, and this is where I wrestle with, that data integrity piece, because as you're describing it and you're talking about, Stranger Things and The Mandalorian, my first, inclination for everything that I know about data analysis, you can't use those shows as a stand-in. They're not the same show. They're not the same demographic. I don't know that they had the same number of episodes. They're not the same genre necessarily. Like, all of those alarm bells start going off in my head of like, but it's not the same. And so how do you start to reconcile that for someone like me who is so stringent about if you're going to have stand-in data, it needs to be a one-to-one.
It depends on the level of risk, right?
Okay.
So in the case of a fandom that is making social media posts to yell at Netflix, the risk of the data being wrong is probably not very high, right? Because Netflix, in this case, is just not going to come out and say, "No, you're wrong. Here's the data that to prove that you're wrong." They will not do that. They will just sit there and their head of PR will just drink all day, right? That's what's going on there. If a company is saying, okay, we want to use this data to make a $5 million investment or a $5 billion purchase, the risk is a lot higher of getting it wrong. And so you would invest a lot more time in calibration. Can you, like a clinical trial, can you account for age and gender and ethnicity and economic background, all those factors that would matter if you were doing a trial to ascertain the treatment aspect of a data set to say, okay, did this treatment controlling for other factors, did it have an impact? If you're making a life-saving drug, boy, you want to be stringent about the data that you want to not substitute whenever you possibly can. So it all comes down to risk. In the case of a client that is looking at one dashboard versus another dashboard, what's the risk of getting that like substantially wrong? In the situation that we know, the risk is relatively low. The risk is relatively low because it's probably not going to change a whole lot, right? But there are other clients who will say like, okay, we're going to make decisions on this. And that's when you say, okay, well, let's spend some more time refining this. Let's spend some more time, knocking out as many anomalies as we can, trying to get apples to apples where it makes sense. The question then becomes, and it's a good question for you, how do you ascertain the level of risk that you're comfortable with?
And I think it comes down to what decisions do you need to make with this information. And so, for those of you who don't know, my background is in clinical trials with opiates and stimulants, and so the abusability of these drugs. And so I could tolerate 0% risk, which I suppose now, why it makes me so well suited for the job that I do now, because I'm always leaning toward 0 risk is allowed. And then we can sort of build the case from there and start to allow 1% risk, 2% risk, and so on and so forth. Versus, I have friends in different industries and different companies where it's like 100% risk is allowed because nobody's going to lose their life. Whereas in my situation, people actually could. And so that's where I would start those conversations of what is the decision that you need to make by having this data comparison. And so Chris, in your case, as you're working with a community to, get a show back on the streaming service, you can probably tolerate more risk because the goal is that they are just trying to get the attention of a network to say, hey, people care about this thing, and here's what happens when you put it back on the air. There's no life or death situation there. In the situation of a client wanting to compare their data to a competitor, it was more of a curiosity than really a decision. And so again, the risk they could tolerate in terms of the data being one-to-one is much higher because the decision being made was, I wonder what they were doing. Instead of us just asking them, let's go ahead and spin our wheels and compare data that doesn't match. So the risk is higher. But that's really that's where you have to start in terms of what data am I comfortable substituting and how many of those variables am I okay not matching? And so if you are handed a stack of data and said, replicate this, I would say the way that I would approach it is I would start to first document, like, here's what I know from the data based on what I'm giving. Here's my outstanding questions. Where can I get answers to these questions? And literally start like a checklist of, here's what I know the date ranges to be. Here's what I know the metrics to be. Here's what I know this. Here's what I know this. And then how much of that can I replicate? And then if I'm left with more unknowns than knowns, I would say the risk is higher because then you're kind of just sort of guessing. But if you have more knowns than unknowns, the risk then becomes lower because you have more control over the data that you're able to put together. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, like, I'm more comfortable tolerating lower risk, but understanding the purpose and why I'm looking at this data in the first place, what decisions, and that's going to tell me how much substitution is okay.
Exactly. I think there's also an element here of the kind of data. In physics, there's this concept of the Heisenberg principle, right? And the Heisenberg principle says that particularly in atomic particles like electrons, you can either know the position of an electron or you can know its direction, but you can't know both. And when we look at the types of data we work with, there's kind of a Heisenberg principle at work there too. When you look at a snapshot of data, like a dashboard, frozen in time, and being asked to replicate it, you are looking at the position of that data. Where is it? And a decent amount of precision is asked for then. If you are looking at trend data, which involves time, you're really looking more at the direction the data is going. The specific atomicity of that data is less important than whether or not you can detect a trend in it. So even if the data is wrong, if it's consistently wrong in a way that can be modeled and predicted, it is directionally still useful, right? If I'm estimating a competitor's organic search traffic and I'm off by 10x, but I'm always off by 10x, I can still measure over time and say, hey, that competitor's going up or that competitor's going down.
Mm-hmm.
I will not know the position, but I can know the direction. And so I think that has to factor into our risk assessment as well, is to say, okay, are we trying to make a positional judgment or a directional judgment for our own decision making? When we're looking at a competitor, do I need to, how fast is that competitor growing, is a more important answer than what is the competitor's current cash flow.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like at the end of the day, if you factor in why you need to know this data, why you need to make the comparison. And I would say, honestly, a lot of that, what we're really talking about in a lot of ways is how companies approach a competitive analysis. They have data to stand in for what they want to know about their competitors. And in some ways, it's good enough to give them some kind of a direction. But when you start to drill down more granularly, that's where you really have to evaluate what is the purpose of this data, what decisions do I need to make, and what risk level am I comfortable with, given that I don't actually have the data, but I'm just making substitutions.
Exactly. At the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, am I going to lose my job for this? If the answer is no, then you have at least a good starting point for assessing risk. If you have comments or things that you've done to substitute data in work that you've done, stop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a platform you would rather have it on, chances are we probably have it. Go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. You can find all the places that this show is. And while you're there, if you have a moment, please leave us a rating or a review. Those certainly do help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.